Where we are right now is a full on, and I'm not dramatizing this, I can give you data on it, a full on extinction event of human contribution and paying attention to what people really need. And one of the parts of the pattern of collapse is the outbreak of internecine warfare. We're going against each other. We don't recognize the enemy at the gate.
Welcome to Engines of Creation. I'm your host, Christian Mastrodonato. The voice you just heard belongs to Margaret Wheatley, and her diagnosis of our current systemic landscape is as stark as it is necessary. On this show, we talk a lot about the art and science of building, whether it's frontier tech, new economic models, or collective intelligence. But there is a dangerous blind spot in the builder's mindset. We're obsessed with growth, and we often look away from entropy. You cannot design a resilient system without studying how it naturally degrades and fails. Meg is a true pioneer in applying complexity science and the physics of living systems to human dynamics. She has spent decades mapping how organizations actually work. Not how we chart them on a whiteboard, but how they behave as biological interconnected networks. Today, we're doing what we might call an ergodic autopsy on modern institutions. We look at the natural life cycle of complex systems, why so many of our structures are currently failing to adapt, and how the biology of fear actively shuts down our capacity for innovation. But this isn't a conversation about despair. It's about clarity. It's about understanding the specific season of history we're in so that we know exactly what kind of work is required of us right now. Before we dive in, if you value conversations that cut through the hype and explore the deep patterns shaping our world, please take a second to follow the show and leave a rating or a like. It is the single best way to help us bring these ideas to other system thinkers. And now, let's go. Welcome all to Engines of Creation. Today we have really a special guest. We have Margaret Wheatley with us today, and this is going to be, I think, a different episode from anything I've listened so far. I'm so excited to have this conversation today with Mag.
All right. Well, I've been a practicing consultant since 1973. I've been a global citizen out in the world, teaching and learning and being members of communities in post-war, very traditional Korea in the 60s. And then I've worked and lived for short periods of time in several Aboriginal communities. I've worked extensively in South Africa and Zimbabwe because I also have an institute focused on creating new models of how to organize the way life organizes. So I've written many books, 13 now. And the book that is bringing us together, Christian, is the book that put me on the map called Leadership and the New Science, where I did make very clear what was going on in quantum theory at the time, in chaos and complexity theory, and how to apply those possibilities to leadership. It was a true paradigm shift, and it did put me on the map. There were enough people who really loved seeing the world through the eyes of new science, and I understood the science, so I could translate it for people. I was in all sorts of organizations and communities, and then it focused more on how do we organize the way life organizes, where with complexity theory, you can create complex systems by just iterating constantly a few rules. So strange attractors became, it was on the cover of Leadership in the New Science, but that became what I taught. How do you create self-organizing organizations that depend on people's creativity and generosity and the human spirit. So my most recent book, because I do keep up with the times, is Restoring Sanity. And the subtitle is more important: Awakening Our Innate Generosity, Creativity, and Kindness Through Practices. I was giving the title of my newest book that came out a year ago, Restoring Sanity: Practices to Awaken Generosity, Creativity, and Kindness in Ourselves and Our Organizations. It is the most practical book ever, and it's about where I am now in this journey, which is the real dangers now. And these are profound dangers. Is that any sensitivity or caring or working with people and our great generosity and kindness and need to be together, all of that is disappearing. And it's disappearing because leaders are overwhelmed with uncertainty and they're fear based, and people are fear based. And when we're in fear, we no longer behave as humans. We do not have access to the frontal lobe. So we're in threat and in fear, and that just demolishes our humanness. So my work has been a very consistent trajectory of how to engage people in the work of the organization. It was a lot simpler when I was only with many, many colleagues talking about conversational, dialogic processes, working from a strong sense of values, and then freeing people to make decisions that were congruent with the organization's goals and values. That's the heart of self organizing. But what's happened now is a destruction or a disinterest or ignorance of what it is to motivate people, what it is to evoke through the way you lead people's need to contribute, need to be part of a good community. So, where I've come is it's not about dealing with the complexity of the world. It's not about good models of leadership, such as full engagement leadership, self organizing leadership. We're in a different state, and we can talk about technology with this because it's something I'm covering now. Of being, someone called it an extinction event, and I'm going to stick with that without it feeling like hyperbole to me. Where is there any interest, support, or acknowledgement or working with people in our full humanity? Human beings being fully human is my catchphrase for that. It's disappearing. And leaders, in response to the overwhelming, they were never good at managing complexity, right? But they had stability. Now, when you add instability and uncertainty to the role of leaders, they go crazy. They're going into command and control. And there's also another dynamic, which is, I mean, now I'm written 3 books on the pattern of collapse of empires. And we're full on in that pattern. And at that point, the elites take everything for themselves. So part of what was disinterest in serving people, talking about servant leadership feels so lovely, so gone, where that beautiful work. But anyway, where we are right now is a full on, and I'm not dramatizing this, I can give you data on it, a full on extinction event of human contribution and paying attention to what people really need. And one of the parts of the pattern of collapse is the outbreak of internecine warfare. We're going against each other. We don't recognize the enemy at the gates. This is historic, happens with every empire. The the enemy at the gates for a long time has been climate, has been the planet and these extraordinary earth changes now. But we're too busy fighting for privilege and wealth, and greed is such a dominant motive now. And that's also in the pattern of collapse. So we're just acting out very well established historic pattern down to the granular level. And what's happening with technology and AI is now part of that. And we can talk about that also. But I'll wait for you to pick up on whatever you want to, Christian.
Thank you. That was probably the most thorough introduction that we got in the podcast. And I think it's very important to hear that because it shows the work that you have to do when you start looking into how complex is our reality in whatever position you are. Doesn't need to be at the top. You end up realizing how everything is intertwined, and especially also that the context matters. And we have recently another guest, Alex the Shamsunsino, who's a designer, and she was making the same point from the perspective of when you design a system, you must understand the world where the system is inside. You cannot take it in isolation, and you need to understand the context, as you pointed out, and realize where we are. So you opened up, of course, a lot of avenues. So it's going to be really hard to cover all of them. But you alluded about we are into a specific historical cycle at this stage. Or better, we are in a specific part of the history cycle, which, as we know, it happens several times. By the way, reading your book, it reminds me of Isaac Asimov, who was very much into that, and all his Foundation cycle was about the cycle of the empire and the sort of the rise and the decadence and so forth. And he was inspired, of course, by the Roman Empire and the history of the Roman Empire. So I'm thinking, if I look at it from as a physicist, I'm like, that's just entropy. Everything starts and has a cycle and it ends.
As a biologist, life is cyclical, period. And we're not getting that. In the Western mythos, we can make everything better and better constantly. Evolution is misunderstood as positive, always positive, and improving capability, which is not what evolution is. So I think the framing is not, I can pick up a lot of things from physics, but when you're talking about cycles, you have to approach it as a biologist or our own experience. We live, we get old, and we die, like the trees, like the plants, like the stars.
It is a very good point. And I think if you look at it from the lens of complex system, you just have different levels of emergence. And in that, and I agree from that perspective that when it comes especially to life and you extend it to societies very easily, you have this cyclical this cyclical view of reality. So where I'm trying to get here is as a leader, as anyone listening to this podcast, is there are a few things. One, how do we deal with this kind of inevitable fact? Okay, whatever things we're going to work on, and I'm looking into the technology world. I often have conversation around the life cycle of a product. I see companies that are trying to keep that thing alive. Well, it's like no one cares anymore. It's just dying, and it's fine. Okay, it's part of the cycle of life. So there are a lot of examples like that. So as a leader, how do we deal with the point that at a certain stage, either the system will ossify in some way and will become overly rigid, or the systems will start dying and withering. Someone would argue that there are two versions of the same thing, by the way. So how well, as a leader, we can recognize this signal and somehow, is it a work of doing something about it, or is it a work about accepting it?
It's a big question because if you're a leader in a large system, you come to realize, and I'm really willing to say that in my experience, all organizations have no more than a 30-year life cycle. And it goes through the creative stage, the very highly idealistic, generative stage, and then it sort of settles in. It has a stable market and it knows what it's doing. And then we use the word ossify, which is a good word for this. Bureaucracies fail under their own weight of procedures and rules. They just implode from that. And they no longer serve the purposes for which they were created. So now we're talking about governments. We're talking about large organizations. And if you're leading one of those, you will have to, it's just in your job description, You'll have to fight like hell to keep it going and to remain profitable and to think that we're just going to come out with new products. So I have great sympathy for leaders who are stuck in that place because large organizations end up not working. I mean, once you start the path of hierarchy, you know where it's going to end. So, my approach, which has always been to appeal to the most humane, forward thinking leaders, is how can you? I mean, I've just been interviewed by a Chinese company in mainland China, which just turned every middle manager into an entrepreneur, gave them resources, gave them liberty and freedom to hire who they wanted. And so far, they've been doing it, I think, for 20 years. And they use leadership in the new science as their Bible. So these middle managers turned entrepreneurs have created 20 new products. And they bought GE Appliances, which was a huge business. They've turned that around. So what they're doing is disintegrating the hierarchy and the roles and giving people resources to be creative. It's brilliant. It's really a brilliant company at this point. But are we going to do that with our large corporations? No, it's impossible. But let's talk about governments for a minute, because this is where you see the real crashing down, crash and burning of empire. And it's not that it happens sometimes in history, it happens always in history. So they become overbearing bureaucracies. Power is centered more and more to the top. And then it's the interests of the top rulers, who are often priests and kings, not caught in the democracy myth. And the people suffer. The people suffer. And then, like the Roman Empire, tax the farmers, and we're destroying farming in many ways in this country and in the UK with mechanized large scale farming instead of individual farms. We're destroying community, things that are failing in England, like the NHS, like education, I would say like parliament, is part of this collapse cycle. And what do you do? Well, you're at that point, I have to say, we're into revolution. We're into opposition, protests, and revolution. That's the course of history. So that's what we have to prepare for. So my work now, which I'm full on excited about, is how do you create small groups of people? I mean, Huang Corporation has done it within, I think they have several thousand employees. But how do we create islands of sanity, places where we can come together fully human, not in fear, but in support and confidence that together we can still create, we can still produce. We used to call these, skunk works in large corporations, but I'm speaking about something much more radical now. And we have to have strong communities for the collapse that's coming. I mean, a lot of people say to me, well, it's a good thing we're going into collapse because these systems are corrupt. Yes, they are. They need to go. But when they go, we will be stuck with enormous issues of no supply chains, no clean water, no, and people turning against one another out of scarcity. I mean, that's also quite historical. So I just want to prepare as many of us as possible as warriors for the human spirit. And I've been training leaders and activists and citizens for 11 years now to take on this role above your leadership role. Are you going to be a champion for people? Are you going to fight the good fight? And are you also going to train yourself so that you are less aggressive, more aware? And that's where I'm ending up now. And it's not masses that are converted. It's a few people who understand I'm willing to fight for this, fight for human capacity, the human spirit, and that's happening, but it's not the the lovely scenario that some people get to. It's like, well, we'll just create a new earth. We'll create a new world, and it will be based on community. Yes, it will, but it will be in the midst of so much loss and so much destruction. And that's where I am. And when people say, wow, you used to be so hopeful, man. And I just say, have you noticed what's happened in the world? Have you noticed where we are right now? Everything is weaponized. The Russians are being well defined as they have weaponized winter in Ukraine. They're using frigid cold as a weapon, taking out the electrical grid. Everything is being weaponized. It's one of the most commonly used words now. So, how do we be a leader in this? That's my big question. I know the conditions. You need to understand and see clearly. You need to trust your own experience as a leader of how to work well with people. That might be your last question. And we need to realize where we are on the cycle, and we are in the last stage, which is collapse.
Let me stop you there because it's where you're coming from has a lot of similarities with the previous podcast guest, Aki Yarvinen. And well, for the listeners, I actually ended up reading your work and learning about your work, starting from references from Aki's Substack. And of course, if anyone is interested to listen to that episode, I'm going to put the link in the description. But I have been battling with this concept myself.
It's very hard to accept.
Yes, exactly. I've been battling, and I can see the danger, but let me play the devil's advocate here, which is somehow question that I have, and I'm sure many would have sort of listening to your words. Is it? Let's look at it from a complex system perspective. How do we make sure? How can we recognize the difference between, let's call it, a general turbulence of the system that is going to settle down, and it can happen in complex systems all the time, in biological systems all the time, versus an actual decline and fall. And I appreciate that when I'm talking about turbulence versus decline and fall, there is a lot of gray in the middle where these two concepts overlap. I'm very much aware. But just for the sake of conversation, you talk about a weaponizing, for example. What are the signs that tell us, well, we need to build this island of sanity because this is not just a turbulence. This is worse.
It's part of a pattern. So the first thing is to understand what the pattern is, the rise and fall of all civilizations all over the globe. Doesn't matter the culture or the geology. This is how it happens. And when you understand that we are no longer in the beautiful summer, let's take a seasonal perspective. So in spring, everyone is idealistic, everyone shares values, everyone is willing, like in a tech startup, right? Any startup you have it, everyone's willing to contribute, and it's all about the purpose. And that's what we see in terrorist organizations also. And then it settles in, it develops standards, standardization, and it develops markets. And it's actually the creation of markets that is the interim period for all empires. So people are delighted because they get more benefit, they get a good life, they get pleasures and material goods that they didn't have before. That's part of this pattern. It's like the summer. But what also happens is for the children who are raised in these good times, they just want more and more good times. So they become quite narcissistic. And gradually, the whole culture feels entitled, and the leaders try and give them everything. And then the markets disappear, the money to give people entitlements disappears, and we get into this final cycle, which is, just notice this. In the final cycle, which is degradation, it's also celebrity worship. So people don't pray to gods, they make gods out of actors, musicians, and sports heroes. So we've just gone through the Olympics. You can go through, you know, all the title competitions, and who are we worshiping? We are worshiping rock stars. We are worshiping sports heroes, and we fight wars about between our teams. You can go back to the 8th century Byzantium, and there were wars between teams. So this is in our human nature, and it makes total sense. And now you see it here so clearly. And in the final stage, it's all about celebrity culture. Look at our leaders now. People are so unhappy for good reasons with leadership everywhere. But then we make them into autocrats because we think that will solve our fear. This is all about human nature and how we respond as in a civilization we move from idealistic startup to very comfortable materialistic living, to the loss of that and the overpromising of leaders, and then we go down together in this. And this is history. This is not my thinking. This is history. And so for me, the first task is, and it's very painful. I mean, I appreciate your experience, Christian. I've had it with thousands of people now. It's just too hard to comprehend. However, once you do understand it, you find meaningful work. Like being a leader or organizer or facilitator of creating a community is meaningful work. I mean, what was started in England with the transition towns 3 or 4 decades ago, preparing community, preparing people. And then how are we going to be together when we don't have this vast interconnectedness? These are the questions I'm in. And my answer is, you know what life does? This is a book I'm writing this month, a short book about creating islands of sanity. They're modeled after the biology of what's in biology called refugia, places where life is still maintained in the midst of destruction. Like you'll see a plant coming out of a volcanic stone, or you'll see in forest fire, there's one little area that is untouched, or you'll see in any place of destruction, life still wants to happen. So the movement of life is creative. It is always trying to figure out what will sustain life. We've lost that focus. That's why the living system science is so rich right now. Life wants to happen, and we can work with those dynamics. But the facing reality is the first terrible, terrible challenge. But once you do, you realize, oh, I can still make a meaningful contribution here. It's just a little different. And it's not the old terms of success, but it's about being together in healthy human relationships, which we've so lost, but it's still there. So that's where I go with this. Once you understand what's going on, what I notice is a lot of people feel relief, and then there's work to be done.
Let's dive into this work to be done because that's what I personally found also most exciting in reading your work. Besides, of course, the obvious connection, what you call the new science, called the complexity science and so forth, as you alluded earlier, is really like the transition into we can do something practical to help. Before going there, I just wanted to note a few interesting things that came up in the podcast, which also alluded at the beginning, because originally your application of the new science was more about helping organization to strip out hierarchy. A couple of comments on that is one, this definitely is a theme that came up multiple times, and thinking Carsten Lumbier more from a, let's say, business point of view, even if he works in a government-owned company. So there was an interesting challenge, but with the teal organization, applying a teal organization, which I think has a lot of similarities what we're talking about. But even recently talking about Bitcoin with Bendeval was more about applying libertarian socialism concept, which is a lot around stripping out hierarchy and people deciding together more from a let's say, a political system, a social system. The thing I find very interesting into these islands of sanity is, as you pointed out, is there is a pivot in the end. Everyone is speaking about the big impact. We're all trying to do big things. And the focus, it sounds to me, of the islands of sanity is more about, let's get together and pivot from the macro to the local. Let's create local communities where people are connected together. And that connectedness is key. And again, connected is a topic that came up a few times. And that's what I find very interesting. Now, when you talk about refugia, though, I wonder, can this approach scale in some way?
I don't know. That's a great question. In my earlier work, where I wasn't using terms like island of sanity or refugia, but I was talking about what we create in the midst of breakdown. If we connect laterally to one another, then we will give birth to the new from the breakdown, and we'll have actually created a place for more and more people to join us in this good work. A few people are using the term, let's create an archipelago of islands. I'm good with that. That was my work through the Berkana Institute for years. We called it translocal, connecting different work, different centers from 12 different countries. We connected those leaders to learn from one another. Incredibly powerful model. I don't know what will be possible. So I hold out that image. We need to know of one another in our different experiments. And the whole point of feeling that we're an island is so we can create the conditions to still offer ourselves in the midst of this breakdown, but as fully human beings. So we're not succumbing, we're helping one another in a sanctuary setting to strengthen the best qualities in one another. And then we take them, we're not disappearing at all. I mean, I'm so focused on service and contribution, but what makes me strong? What keeps me sane? What keeps me focused on true perception and not reacting with aggression? I have to be in a community to do that, of other people where we're supporting each other to strengthen these qualities. And then I go back out in the world. That's where I vow to be, actually. So these are not self protective, well, at least we'll feel good while the world goes to shit. No, this is how can I still contribute to that world? And I do know all of the work on Warriors for the Human Spirit is we have to learn how to deal with these terrible emotions now, grief and rage and powerlessness, because we can't stop what's happening. And at least at the level at which it needs to be stopped. But also, how do I cultivate an awakened mind? How do I cultivate equanimity? How do I not get so triggered, so rageful all the time? And I'm speaking very personally here. I'm in rage every day watching what's happening in this country to innocent, good people who've been labeled as beasts because they're immigrant. I mean, it's horrendous what's going on here now. I want to stay out there serving people. And to do that, I need this place of refuge where together we are strengthening one another. But the whole point is to be strengthened in an island setting, a protective setting, so that we can stay in these workplaces, in these governments, in these communities.
It is a beautiful concept.
And it's working. It's working.
Yes. And while I was listening to you, actually, a chapter of your book came up. The title of the chapter is linked to a concept that I love, which is the concept of emergence. And I think that's where the answer to my question about scaling really goes, is if you create the right conditions, the answer will emerge. And to me, the other word associated to that, you talked about connect, and as you talked about sanity, is trust, is trusting one another. If we can create the right condition and we trust in the people, who are creating these conditions, the right solution will emerge. It's really believing in not in command and control. It cannot make a plan and say these island of sanity are going to work it out. We'll have to find out and let the community together emerge with a new solution. Does it make sense?
Except solution. I was with you up until solution because the whole,
Let's go with that. Please, I'm curious.
yeah, let's talk about chaos theory for a moment here. There is deterministic chaos that creates these beautiful strange attractors, that creates order out of chaos. But that is called deterministic chaos because at the human level, there's values, there's agreement, there's coherence about who we are and what we value. That's formally what held societies together, is usually a religious perspective and practice and orthodoxy. But then there's real chaos that can never settle because we do not have this coherence at the core. That's where we are. So you can create order for free in a self organizing system, which I am now defining as a specific bounded area using the island mentality image. But we know that whatever we create will be of benefit to people. And yet, in the greater world, what's going on is absolutely indeterminate, pure chaos. So when I stopped with right solutions, it's like, who knows what's going to be useful next month? But what we always know is if you awaken people's spirits and again, their innate creativity, our innate desire to be together and help one another. These are the basic qualities of being human. Wherever we are, we can support people to awaken to their own potential. But what's going to happen to them in this greater turmoil or tumult or pure chaos, it's unclear. So we're really now getting down to what is the means by which I ground myself, my values, my understanding of this life? And that's where I could instantly sound like a preacher, but really we've been so distorted and in this illusion of what success is, what a good life is. And now we're coming back to basics that a good life is serving your neighbor, being faithful, understanding there's more going on than your own private human ego experience, and wanting to contribute beyond ourselves, period. Now, indigenous people have held this wisdom for a very long time, much longer than we give credit to. We keep going back in history to when we developed capacities like fire. Well, that's back to 1 million years ago. Hominids used fire. How long ago did hominids, not not Homo sapiens, but some form of hominid, practice rituals upon death? Well, we have an implement, a carving that's at least 350,000 years old that was made to lay in a funerary pit for the passage of the spirits of the dead. So we go back much farther in time with good things, care for one another, working to improve life. And yet we think we're the top of the heap right now with all our technology, but we're so separated from one another. And this is where I want to bring in physics, because for me, the absolute truth of physics is that nothing living lives alone. Everything manifests in relationships. I was very strong on that in leadership in the new science. Now I'm constantly just saying, nothing is visible until it's in relationship, even elementary particles that go into colliders. What are they colliding with? They're colliding with other energies. And then something is instant visible for a nanosecond. So when people use the term quantum now, which is, I never know what they mean as a descriptor. But for me, quantum reality is, first of all, we are barely understanding or seeing what's going on because we only have these very five limited senses that we worship as scientific materialism. But what is going on in these energy fields of space, or in our bodies, the energy fields in the space that's within every molecule in our body, it's all about relationship. So I can find a lot of support through biology and physics of what I'm speaking about. So that's where I brought the new science front and center. But it's really about what is the value of a human life? And what is my value as a human in this life? And more people are coming to terms with that. Hopeful that it'll be vast numbers, but it's upswelling of people wanting to understand how to be in healthy relationships and how to find meaning that's independent of materiality. Amen.
It's interesting because you covered a lot of things that I've been spending a lot of time personally over the last few years. As many listeners know, I am myself a physicist, a quantum physicist, at least in theory. I'm following the evolution over the last few years, and there are a lot of interesting avenues going on. One avenue, personally, I'm very interested about, for example, is the work that Stephen Wolfram has been doing, which you kind of alluded at the very beginning, talking about chaos or complexity arising from just small increments, which is the original work of Wolf of the automaton.
It's an original formula that defines and that it continues to feed back on itself. This is pretty cheap. And this is all about at an organizational or human level about identity. How am I self-referencing?
My point I was trying to make is that your connection to relationship
Yeah.
as a center of everything is key. A few things I'm definitely noticing is if we go back historically, looking at the physics in particular analogy, we got stuck into think of things in terms of matter, of things, and not of relationships. But if you look at the actual science evolution of the last 150 years, it's all about relationships and not about things.
Right.
But we can't. I think culturally we're still stuck into the 18th century as a mindset, or even earlier, and we never really moved out from that materialistic world. And that's why you can see now science getting, in a sense, closer and closer to Eastern philosophy.
Yes.
That many scientists want to admit. And that's an interesting cycle. But I clearly understand why you were a bit uncomfortable with the word solution I used before, because it's too materialistic. It implies we're going to put something together, but it's not going to work like that. The way I'm seeing your islands of sanity, looking at the example of emergence, I see them as seeds. You talked about a cycle. We're at the end of a cycle. And if we want to keep a hopeful view, we're going to have a new cycle. And we are going to have those seeds, those refugia that you talked about, that are just going to flower. What flower is going to come out? We don't know. But we want to plant those seeds. I think that's really at the end
Yeah.
what your recent work is about.
Yeah. That works for me. I mean, that's what Mother Nature does with refugia. Those are places where life is sustained so that after everything settles, more life it can migrate out from there. And I just don't know how long that's going to take. But I have a feeling it's hundreds of years, but this is a good way to end, Christian. We want to know, most people want to have hope, and I'm using the word very specifically, want to have hope that all these efforts will bear fruit in a future time. And there's beautiful quotes that I've used, let us plant trees under whose shade we will never sit, or let us plant fruit trees whose fruit we will never. So we're trying to surrender to the future and let our actions be meaningful, but they're still mainly meaningful with some hopeful vision of the future. I have written a lot about hope and fear are the same two-sided coin. And if we're doing our work for a future that we have no idea about, if we're doing our work for that, we're going to be bitterly disappointed when it doesn't happen the way we think. But if we're doing our work now, it's Václav Havel's quote on hope that it's not the confidence that something will turn out well. It's the certainty that something is worth doing no matter how it turns out. And that's where I want us all to how can we be the best human beings and the best community and create the best circumstances and bring that to other people? Are we planting seeds? Maybe. But it's present moment awareness is the great solution to anxiety and fear. So let's just do it. And it'll be fun to do it. It'll be creative. We can really exhibit our best qualities. But we've got to accept the fact that we are not saving the world. We're not fixing things. We're creating again places of possibility.
That's beautiful. It's a beautiful concept. Thank you for sharing it. I mentioned already, I'm personally struggling with some of this concept, and
Always.
I'm really grateful that we had this conversation. And it's interesting how you managed to pick my bias and challenge them. Now, I think this was a beautiful journey. I would just, if possible, and with the last question I ask all my guests, which is, what are the characteristics of a leader who embraces complexity for you?
Well, I'm going to define it not as a leader who embraces complexity, but as a sane leader. And for me, sane leaders, I write this a lot, have unshakable confidence in people's capacity to be generous, creative, and kind. But the leader's role is to create the conditions so that those qualities can be made real, can be visible. And that's a real role of leadership because we have to have more faith in people than they have in themselves right now. We have to get past their fear and create the conditions where they can truly relax, come together, and remember how good it feels when we're in good work together. And that's my definition. The responsibility of the leader is to create those conditions. Now, you can do it in some teams, in large systems, but that's an uphill battle. Or you can do it within your community, or you can do it as creating these islands of sanity. But that's a big responsibility. We have to have more faith in people than we see evidence for right now. You know, people caught in fear are not generous or creative or kind. They're self protective. So it's a big, wonderful job.
I think it is the responsibility of this sane leader to create the condition for these people to give their best. I think that that's really the job.
To understand that they are capable of doing good creative work in
Yeah, yeah,
healthy relationships. Yes.
yeah. It's yeah, and then they can get out of the fear. They can get out of those negative states, and be part of the community. I love that, and it applies everywhere. It has been absolutely amazing. I'm really grateful for this conversation, Mac, and thank you very much for being a guest of Angels of Creation.
I just want to and honor your curiosity and your big questions and just stay with those, you know, with the discomfort when it's a really big question, go there. I think you're doing that already and you're very responsive and threading my work to earlier people who spoke here. That's great. That's your skill, Christian. Just keep doing that.
Thank you very much. It's really appreciated.